What do you see when you watch a war movie? Do you see young boys dying senseless, bloody deaths, or do you see patriots fighting for what's right? Maybe a little bit of both. In the span of just 2 years, from 1929 to 1930, there were 3 Academy Awards ceremonies and 2 Best Picture winners set during World War I. So, what makes Wings feel like a glorification of the military and the bravery of these men, while All Quiet on the Western Front is largely considered the first and still one of the greatest anti-war films of all time? All Quiet on the Western Front was based on the book of the same name by German author. Sometimes with these names, I don't know if I should try to say it in a bad approximation of the native language. Erich Maria Remarque. Or just really lean into my Jersey American accent. Erich Maria Remarque. Either way, he was conscripted into the German Imperial Army to fight the Great War at the age of 18 until he was wounded by shrapnel, and then he spent the rest of the war recovering from his wounds. The book tells the story of Paul and a group of his fellow soldiers as they experienced the brutality and monotony and senselessness of war. We have become wild beasts. We do not fight, we defend ourselves against annihilation. It is not against men that we fling our bombs. What do we know of men in this moment when death is hunting us down? It was first published in serial form in 1928 and then as a book in 1929, becoming the best-selling work of fiction in America for that year. And then in 1930, the film was released. Now look, I understand that I am a father of 2, rapidly approaching middle age, but contrary to what you might think, I don't actually know all that much about World War I. Maybe when I turn 40 in a couple years, I'll suddenly be surrounded by Ron Chernow books, but until then, I'll have to do my own research. And as far as I can tell, World War I was, for the most part, a war that people look back on and said, what the f*** were we thinking? It was a new kind of war with modern weapons that went on much longer than anyone had anticipated. Many lives were lost in gruesome ways, and the men that did come back were emotionally and psychologically scarred. So, what's up with Wings? The William Wellman film I talked about when it won Outstanding Picture at the first Academy Awards. In 100 Years of Cinema's video, Is There Such a Thing as an Anti-War Film? They talk about how it often can come down to perspective. One person can watch the storming of Normandy Beach in Saving Private Ryan and see the horrors and senselessness of war, while another person sees the glory of fighting for freedom. 2 people seeing the same thing with drastically different takeaways. But in this specific comparison between Wings and All Quiet on the Western Front, I think there's a bit more to it. In his essay, Anti-War War Films, Dennis Rothermel says, the employment of anti-war messages will entail resistance to conventional structures of character development, narrative, and message that the film industry has found successful in marketing its product, particularly pandering to the easy reactions of celebrating courageous vindication against despicable enemies. And in my opinion, that's the difference. The conventional rules don't really apply here. Paul doesn't have an inciting incident. He doesn't have a hero's journey. The film stays very faithful to the book for the most part and is essentially a series of vignettes in which we see through Paul's eyes each of his friends get maimed or killed. And their deaths are arbitrary and meaningless to the larger story. While when we see David die at the end of Wings, it means something because we just spent the last 2 hours watching that relationship develop and grow. We get closure in that moment. Jack goes home, commiserates with the grieving family, and rides off into the sunset, so to speak, with Clara Bow. A tragic end, but an end to their narrative. The closest thing we get to that in All Quiet is the death of Kaczynski, which does act as a final blow to Paul's spirit, but it isn't a conclusion, just another death in this seemingly infinite battle. There's also no villains here. There are explicit conversations that are probably a little too didactic.
I don't want to shoot any Englishmen. I never saw one till I came up here. And I suppose most of them never saw a German till they came up here.
About how they have no reason to be fighting. They don't hate the other side. At one point, Paul is trapped with a dying Frenchman who he stabbed in a moment of panic and fear, and talks about how they could be friends in another life.
Why should they send us out to fight each other? If we threw away these rifles and these uniforms, you could be my brother, just like Cat and Albert.
Whereas in Wings, the other side is essentially just full of cartoon bad guys. It's worth mentioning that these are both American-made films, but while Wings is about the American military, All Quiet on the Western Front follows German soldiers. I think it was probably an easier pill to swallow for Americans to watch German soldiers sitting around talking about how all this fighting is pointless and how they could be friends with the enemy when we were the enemy. The boys in wings were raring to go and fight the Kaiser, never stopping to consider the lives inside the planes they were shooting down. There's a bigness to Wings that really shows the power and the magnitude and the strength of the American military, and there's even a German character trying to convince everyone that he's a patriotic American. Pauline Kael wrote about All Quiet on the Western Front. The year 1930 was, of course, a good year for pacifism, which always flourishes between wars. Milestone didn't make pacifist films during the Second World War, nor did anybody else working in Hollywood. And wasn't it perhaps easier to make All Quiet just because its heroes were German? War always seems like a tragic waste when told from the point of view of the losers. Not so fun fact, but when the Nazi Party was starting to come to power, All Quiet on the Western Front was one of the first books to be burned, and the film protested because of the way they felt it denigrated the German military. I don't actually think I've said it yet, but I think All Quiet on the Western Front is a great film. There are a few moments where the performances can get a little bit of their time.
And I came outside, and it felt so good to be alive that I started in to walk fast. I began to think of the strangest things, like being out in the fields, things like that. You know, girls.
But aside from that, the battle scenes are epic. You see how I just referred to a battle scene as epic? That's me falling into the trap of glorifying war. I see these battles and I'm impressed by the filmmaking, and while I can intellectually keep the filmmaking and the realities of war separate in my head, the way I talk about it and the way the filmmaking makes me feel conflates it in a messy way. Anyway, the final moments of the boys looking back superimposed over the graves of fallen soldiers could be cheesy, but I think the film earns the moment, and I think it's genuinely devastating. My other favorite moment of the film is very early on when the boys' teacher convinces them to enlist. They tear up their classroom in excitement, and after they've marched out singing a patriotic song, Milestone lingers on the ravaged classroom, a military parade passing in the background. This place that represents their innocence and their future is empty and in tatters as they march off to their fate. To me, that, more than anything else, is the most haunting imagery in the whole film. And so, in my opinion, it deserved to win Best Picture at the 3rd Academy Awards, which took place on November 5th, 1930, in the Fiesta Room at the Ambassador Hotel, and for the first time, a portion of the ceremony was filmed, and not to brag, but I actually attended the ceremony.
I'm about to introduce to you a gentleman that, while he is a very dear friend of mine, is also a very strong competitor for this honor, and I'm going to call him out here that you may have a good look at him, and then I will have much more to say.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's such a pleasure to be here. And all I want to say to everyone in Hollywood tonight is corn. I love it. It's a big lump with knobs. Right? It has the juice. It has the juice. I know. The ceremony actually took place only 7 months after the last awards in an attempt to make them closer to the eligibility period, so 1930 was the only year with 2 Academy Awards ceremonies. All Quiet on the Western Front was the first film to be adapted from a novel to win Best Picture. It was the first Best Picture winner to also win Director for Lewis Milestone. Milestone was the first person to win a second Academy Award, his first being for Best Director Comedy for Two Arabian Nights at the first Oscar ceremony, and it was the first time siblings won. Douglas Shearer for Best Sound Recording and Norma Shearer winning Best Actress for The Divorcee. Speaking of Norma Shearer, I have this book which is basically just facts about every Academy Awards ceremony up until 2013, but they talk about a controversy with Norma Shearer winning because she was married to Irving Thalberg, the second in command at MGM, and maybe he swayed votes. Brian Rowe Video mentions it in his video on the 3rd Academy Awards, but I haven't actually seen much mention of it other places. The authors of this book, on the other hand, seem very bitter about it. Listen to this. Shearer was beside herself with shock and amazement as she swept up to the podium to accept. It was by far her best performance of the year. Meow. They're currently in post-production, I think, for a remake, a reinterpretation of the book, All Quiet on the Western Front, that I believe is going to pop up on Netflix sometime in 2022. It's going to be in German. I've seen some of the production stills, and it looks amazing. I'm very excited to check it out, just like you're interested in checking out my video on The Broadway Melody, an abomination of a film, and the first talkie to win Best Picture.